We're back. Strength and Knowledge is back. I'm John Allan, and in this episode, Dr. Josh Sproul and I break down the role of plyometrics across the entire performance continuum, from clinical rehab to explosive demands of elite level sport. During the discussion, we break down the clinical application of contrast training and the physiological mechanics of the stretch shortening cycle. We analyze how to leverage the eccentric phase to maximize vertical jump performance while reviewing the research-backed framework for plyometric dosage in a rehab setting. Without further ado, let's get into it. Dr. Josh Sproul, aka Easy Vert, Mr. Faith Over Fear himself, welcome to Strength and Knowledge. You put out great content in the field of plyometrics and building athleticism as a whole, but for those in the audience who are unfamiliar, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do with your programming.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on here in the Strength and Knowledge podcast. So I'm a physical therapist living and working out of like the coastal Delaware, Ocean City area. I am a former dual sport collegiate athlete and I love athletics and improving athletic performance. So during grad school, I went ahead and developed EasyVert, which can be found on Instagram at EasyVertJump. This is just like my online platform that I use where I train clients both online and in person. What I've done with that is just try to develop a sense of like an online presence so I can give access to people outside of where I'm physically located at, like all the tools and ideas that I've put together over the past few years. It's constantly growing, it's constantly changing, and I'm excited where I'm at with it and excited to keep it going and just excited to be on this podcast here.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. So we're definitely going to dive into like this athleticism and plyometric type exercises. And the first point I want to talk about is the French contrast training. So you put out a lot of great content on this. And I want to dive into kind of like the physiology behind it and kind of where this finds its way into your training program. So again, how early are we introducing this with regards to like an athlete who maybe has a low versus high training age? And what adaptations are you kind of trying to achieve through this training?
So I think one thing to really understand first before diving into like French contrast training is just what contrast training is in itself. So all that is just pairing heavy strength-based movement or lift with a non-heavy, either a light loaded or non-loaded explosive power movement. So this can be something like a heavy back squat or heavy trap bar deadlift paired with a max effort 10-yard sprint or a max effort vertical jump. Or something like, if we're talking upper extremity, something like a heavy bench press paired with something like a plyo push-up or an explosive med ball toss or something of that nature. So the whole idea behind contrast training is to pretty much fire up the nervous system, recruit or maximize motor recruitment before jumping into an explosive movement. And it's something that is very useful in training because it's a way to just get that athlete fired up and ready to jump before saying like, hey, I want to do three vertical jumps. Like I think it's best to activate those motor units and really get the nervous system firing, get the muscles firing in preparation for that explosive movement. Um, that's pretty much what contrast training is. And French contrast training is a little bit different. So when we think of contrast training, it's usually just two exercises, mainly a heavy strength-based movement, like I said, followed by an explosive power movement. When we get into French contrast training, it's more of like a circuit style of training where we're combining like upwards to four different exercises. And the goal is the same. The training adaptations is the same. We want to improve explosive power or power output. So we're talking vertical jump or a broad jump or sprint or explosive med ball throw, something like that. The goal is the same, but with French contrast, we're using more of a circuit style. So we always begin with a heavy strength movement. That's like the first step in any of this contrast training. So we're talking somewhere between 75 to 85% of a one rep max for about 3 reps. We're not trying to max out. We want to have at least 2 to 3 reps in reserve because we're not trying to fatigue the athlete. We want to maximize motor recruitment, get the muscles fired up before jumping into the next exercise. So the heavy strength based movement is going to be the first thing in French contrast training. Second exercise in the circuit will be some sort of non-weighted or light loaded jump, similar to a contrast training set. So you think about the first two being just like a regular contrast training set. We're going from a heavy strength-based exercise and following it up with an explosive movement or jump. And then from there, we're jumping into more of like a light loaded exercise. So we're talking maybe like a light loaded trap bar jump or a light loaded dumbbell squat jump. And then from there, we go into more of like an overspeed or assisted movement. So this could be something like a band assisted jump or a downhill sprint. And then we're combining all of these things in sort of like a circuit to maximize power output, rate of force development, speed, explosive power. So the whole idea behind contrast training too is to maximize this theory or phenomenon called the post-activation potentiation phenomenon. So what this does is when you pair a heavy strength-based movement with a lighter explosive movement, we're in this like heightened neural state so we can respond and move quickly or more powerfully. And that's the whole idea behind it. But the goal with French contrast training is max power output, speed, explosive power, high velocity. That's why we're pairing something like a band assisted jump because we need to be able to produce force quickly. So we want to produce a lot of force, but if we're not producing it quickly, then we're not really going after what we're going after. So I think this is a more complex style of training. So when it comes to introducing it, I would not introduce it right away. This would be more later fit. If we're talking rehab, from a physical therapy standpoint, it would be more later phase rehab. If we're talking just like training with an athlete that's probably not dealing with an injury, I would wait until they feel comfortable with the movements. So taking time to really learn the coordination behind a vertical jump or a band assisted jump, like these things need to be drilled in first. They need to have a foundational sense of like strength. They need to be able to perform a heavy lift properly with good mechanics. If they can't perform a heavy back squat, then I'm not going to throw them in this complex circuit where we're lifting heavy and then jumping, doing explosive movement. Um, so I'd say once they get that down, then it's something that can be added right into their training. It'd be hard to pinpoint an exact number of like weeks in their cycle because if I'm working with a Division I football player who comes home and he's on the beach for the summer and he wants to get in the gym or whatever and work out, this is something that I would throw in early if we're trying to maximize explosive power output. Or say a basketball player that's playing AAU and he's already been training a little bit. This is something that we'll do pretty early. I don't have to wait long before I add this in to see these benefits. So that was I don't know if I answered the second part of that question.
Yeah, I think you did. And I'll kind of just like summarize briefly and kind of like summarize. 'Cause you made a lot of great points, and I just kind of want to bring them all together in regards to like adaptations. Like I think you did a great job of highlighting like we're looking for athleticism. So when we think of athleticism, we think of rate of force development, change of direction, explosion, force development, all power, all that good things. And we also think of strength, but I think you did a good job of kind of like highlighting it was more about the explosive capacities of performance and kind of leaving strength adaptations to more of like your power base or your strength based lifts and not overwhelming the system with that like immediate or pretty soon after explosive movement like the plyometric. I think like you did a great job of kind of just making sure that strength adaptations really truly come from those like hypertrophy sets and things like that. And this contrast training is predominantly for more athleticism type things.
Yeah, absolutely. If the goal is to improve athleticism, which this is, that's what the French contrast and contrast training is going to do. It's going to hit all those explosive power qualities. And pure raw strength is going to be like the driver behind max force output. So we need to make sure we're still hitting those areas. So like after the contrast training set, we need to make sure we're doing our heavy like 5x5 back squats or bench press. So we're like still getting these strength adaptations because that's not going to come from these explosive power movements. This is more explosive power in itself, and we'll leave strength training separate from this in that sense. Um, One thing that I do want to talk about, like while we're on this topic, is like how important specificity is. I don't know if anybody out there is familiar with Joe DeFranco. He's like a famous strength coach and gym owner out of like the New Jersey area, works with a lot of NFL guys. And I was recently listening to a podcast of his on this topic, and he had mentioned how he used this contrast training in his off season or combine prep with his athletes, and they were doing like heavy 2 rep back squats followed up with like 10-yard max sprints. And what he found is like using that post activation potentiation phenomenon, 7 out of all 7 guys were able to PR in their 10-yard sprint time immediately following the 2 rep back squat. And then after that, what he did is he had those same guys perform a heavy sled push, about a 10-yard sled push, and then follow that up with the 10-yard max effort sprint. And then all 7 out of 7 of those guys PR'd again. So I think that just drives home like the importance of specificity. So when we're doing these French contrast training sets, we don't want to do a heavy back squat and then follow that up with a sprint if we want to be as specific as possible. So there's ways to still recruit all these muscles in max strength uh, ways. Like we're trying to like activate max strength, but also be as specific as possible. And I think that's something to remember when we're doing these contrast training sets. It can't be random exercises thrown together and say, yeah, I'm going to improve my vertical jump height. We need to make sure our strength movement is vertical in nature, and that's going to drive home like these adaptations that we're going for.
Yeah, it almost counteracts it, right? If you're training the first rep in a muscle group that's not predominantly activating the second follow up post action potential exercise, it's almost like recruiting more of the other muscles that are not specific to that follow up task, like you're saying in the sprint, right? It could almost like I said, counteract and decrease the potential of performance in that follow up exercise. Yeah, I think you hit that home pretty well. I think movement competency is another thing that you talked about as well, priming the athlete for that potential of force production. And then just being an athlete is always finding themselves in an uncomfortable position. I think French contrast and contrast training does that naturally. Just, man, that set is going to suck. But again, you need to go through that to be ready for whatever the field, mat, court, whatever it may be, is going to throw at you. So, any other points you want to make on contrast training before we kind of get into some other fun topics?
Um, some key things to think about too with French contrast training or contrast training in general is we want to make sure we're not fatiguing the athlete too much in that specific session. So it looks cool, and sometimes it sounds good to say, I'm doing this contrast set or this French contrast set, and I'm just bouncing through it circuit after circuit after circuit, and I'm not resting in between sets. And if that's the case, then we're really leaving adaptations on the table because we're not resting, recovering, so we're not allowing the muscle enough time to rest and then perform at its highest level or peak level for the next set. So rest time is going to be key here. We're talking upwards of like 2 to 5 minutes in between sets, fully recover before jumping into the next exercise. And yeah, and then reps and sets here, we want to make sure that our reps and sets are like inversely related. So if we're going to be doing a French contrast training set or a contrast set, we want to make sure that we're doing low reps, high intensity. And then with this being said, we can kind of up the amount of sets up a little bit. So we can do upwards to like 4 or 5 sets if we're only doing like 2 back squats, 2 band assisted jumps, 2 counter movement jumps. Um, because we can get that volume in and we can allow for the athlete to rest and perform at their highest level. So that's just a couple of other key things to think about when we program in French
Yeah, it
contrast.
takes me right into my next point of like dosage for plyometrics, right? Like people on the internet, they put out lots of content of plyometrics, 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 but I feel like the one of the gaps in the content is like overtraining plyometrics can do damage and create fatigue, whether that's jumper's knee, patellar tendonitis, some sort of that. So I just wasn't sure if like you came across any research on the sweet spot of like plyometric to typical strength training, like if on a week cycle or a month cycle or anything like that. And yeah, just kind of put your input on dosage regarding plyometrics.
Yeah. Um, I think that like out in the National Strength and Conditioning Association, they have for beginner athletes, for plyometric exercises, we're talking 80 to 100 foot contacts or ground contacts per session, within each session. And then an intermediate level athlete, 100 to 120 foot contacts per session. And then more advanced, 120 to 140 ground contacts per session. I think that that's great and all, but it's going to vary depending on like your athlete, the size of the athlete, what type of plyometric exercises you're doing. It's very general, so it's something that you have to consider when you're programming plyometrics. A big thing to consider is how many single leg based movements are you doing? Because if you're doing a single leg jump, you're taking on more ground reaction force than a double leg jump. Think about the force that's going through one leg. So if I'm programming for a day where I'll do this, I'll do a unilateral day where we're focusing on unilateral power and single leg plyometrics. I might cut that in half. So instead of like 120 ground contacts for my advanced athlete, I'll dial that back and we're only doing 60 ground contacts whatsoever. And then, like you mentioned, it is very fatiguing on the body, on the central nervous system. So it's something that we need to be considering. We need to make sure that we're given adequate amounts of rest in between plyometric training sessions. So you may see things on Instagram that might be misleading that say, do this plyometric exercise every day to boost your athleticism. And it sounds good and all, but really, if you do that plyometric exercise every single day, you're really setting yourself up for failure because your body needs to recover. Your body takes time to develop these adaptations. So I think spacing it out, I like leaving that 48 to 72 hours in between sessions for each plyometric session to kind of guide my training. And then plyos are useful for the upper body as well as the lower body. So if you're doing lower body plyometrics on Monday, you can do upper body plyometrics on Tuesday or Wednesday. I think that's perfectly fine. That's safe. But what becomes an issue is when we're doing lower body or all upper body plyometrics back to back days or 3 days in a row, just because I'm trying to get as much training as possible because I have my high jump competition on Friday. So Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I'm going to do plyos because I think this is going to help me. And it's really just going to set you back because it's very demanding on the body. It's really tough on the tendons and everything. So it's something to just consider. Make sure you're giving yourself enough rest. I like that 48 to 72 hours in between sessions. And then I do follow like the general guidelines with like the somewhere between 80 to 140 ground contacts, but I try to scale it in terms of like how many single leg jumps am I doing? How many double leg jumps am I doing? How large is my athlete? Because if my athlete is 220 pounds, he's not going to perform the same amount of contacts in a training week as my athlete who's 120 pounds. So just key things to consider.
Right. Yeah. And I'll kind of connect it back to like rehab when like we get to the end stage and maybe the athlete is back to sport, back to running, whatever it may be. I find a lot of times that I'm kind of overdosing regarding like plyometrics in a clinic because I'm like, okay, they're at this plyometric phase. They need to be doing plyometrics. They need to be getting the contact times up. All those adaptations we talked about in that first point of like rate of force development, all that kind of stuff. But I'm not really counting all the ground contact times that they had for their runs, all the ground contact times they had in practice, games, whatever it may be. And I find myself a lot of times like correcting myself, like, hey, like let's not be the plyometric guy today. Let's be the strength, endurance, mobility type guy today, just to kind of find that place in the rehab, especially towards the end, where we're no longer doing that like sport specific stuff. We're letting them get all those contacts and change of direction contacts late in their practices and games, and we'll kind of supplement with more mobility, feel good type strengthening exercises. But again, I think like you said, you hammered that home about like the dosage and stuff like that, and making sure they're getting that rest from that more explosive movements. Because again, central nervous system fatigue is a real thing. I find myself using like grip strength sometimes, even with my lower body athletes, just kind of getting that number. Hey, what are we at today? What have we done with our ground contacts, our volume of practice, our volume of games, and just kind of going from there. Once I get that number, obviously you got to measure that consistently to know where they're at. But again, that is a good, pretty supported evidence of central nervous system fatigue. Um, Anything else regarding like dosage before we get into our last point?
I don't think so. I think that's it for right now.
Perfect. Our last point I want to kind of talk on is like the vertical jump. A lot of people are worried about how high they can jump, and they're putting lots of force and practice into the concentric phase of the jump. But again, we know with the stretch shortening cycle that that eccentric phase is just important. And you just put out a post about the accentuated eccentric loading, and I just wanted you to kind of hit on that point of kind of what that even is and how you're educating your athletes on maximizing this short stretch shortening cycle.
Yeah, this is an area that I love a lot. Like I love training the stretch shortening cycle and the complete cycle too. You mentioned that some athletes just focus on that concentric phase and exploding out of it, which is great and all because that's part of the stretch shortening cycle. But we need to make sure that we're hitting all key areas and really emphasizing that eccentric phase because that's the foundation. That's where it all starts. That's where it all begins. Like the stretch shortening cycle is a rapid eccentric into like the amortization phase, which is like where you're transitioning into that explosive concentric movement. So the eccentric phase is just the most important phase to me. That's the foundation. That's the driver of it all. Now, really quick, I do want to say that training the concentric phase is important and it's not something that we want to neglect by any means. We want to make sure that we're hitting all areas. And honestly, in athletes like offensive linemen or anything where you're starting low and exploding up. So like even if you think about like wrestlers and you're down low and you need to explode out and make a move, I think maybe biasing that exploding from the bottom and concentric phase explosive power is going to be key. And I may program more of that in their training program, but we're talking about training the vertical jump and the entire stretch shortening cycle. We need to make sure that we're hitting all key areas. So the post I made today on attenuated eccentric loading, um, I don't know if my video was actually correct because like the goal of that is to like actually like really load the eccentric phase. So you want to be like max effort, even like over 100% of a one rep max think back squat, really load it up and then drop that weight and explode out of it. Um, and what that does too is it trains the eccentric phase in more of like a strength manner, and then you're driving that concentric phase up. But it's a good way to just hit all key areas of the stretch shortening cycle, the amortization phase, that's what that hits mainly because we're thinking about coming down from something heavy and exploding out really quick. So we're like maximizing that middle phase where we're transitioning. Um, but the eccentric phase is so important. It's that pre-phase before we're transferring force. It's where we're developing most of our force that's going to be transferred through the tendons, through the series elastic components of the musculotendinous unit, and into that explosive concentric phase. So if we're not training the eccentric fast, quick, even slow, then we're just leaving gains on the table. Um, I like to think try to test your vertical jump by sinking down to the bottom of like so if you think about a counter movement jump, slow it down a little bit. Sink down, pause for 5 seconds, and then jump up, and then try a counter movement jump where you're sinking down fast and exploding up. You'll probably jump close to twice as high just by simply throwing that fast eccentric phase in. And then that's so important. And then even like things like I know when we're measuring lower body power, we don't really use the arm swing, but if you are testing your vertical jumping, you swing your arms down aggressively, that's just like adding more force to that eccentric force production that's going to transfer and lead to more explosive concentric power. Um, so it's just a part of training that can't be neglected. Like we need to make sure that we're doing the things that are going to actually lead to improving the vertical jump and all components of the stretch shortening cycle. We can't leave any gains on the table, and it's very important. And if you don't train it, you'll see why your vertical jump hasn't been improving if you do start to train it and then retest your vertical jump.
Yeah, ironically, every time I get on the force decks, the vault force decks, that I always find the eccentric rate of force development is always asymmetrical. Again, some of that is natural, some of that is obviously due to pain, range of motion, whatever it may be, apprehension to movement. But again, I find myself always seeing that eccentric rate of force development a little bit higher than the concentric and force at zero amortization phase. So again, it's just testament to that phase is so important, not only for performance, but also for that rehab and returning back to baseline. Um, Anything else you want to talk about? I think we hit on a lot of great points today. Is there anything else you want to kind of wrap us up with in regarding this topics?
I would just say, well, following up real quick on what you just mentioned, I really like the force plates that you guys use there at Rehab to Perform. I think they're very useful in terms of seeing that eccentric rate of force development. I remember on my rotation there with Dr. Greg, we would use that a lot, and that's something that I don't use as much now. I mean, they're expensive. My company doesn't have them. I use like a little OVR jump device, which is great and all. It can tell me like vertical jump height, ground contact time, and RSI. But like that eccentric force production is a key component of training, and I think that's something that I just try to hammer into all of my athletes because I know how important it is. I can't really if I don't have the force plates, then I'm not testing it. So I'm making sure that I'm training it because I don't want that to be the missing part of the puzzle or the missing piece of the puzzle. So I make sure that I hammer that in. Um, Anything else? No, I think we had a great discussion today, covered a lot of key areas that are going to help a lot of people out in terms of understanding the foundation and basics to explosive power and plyometrics.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for hopping on. I appreciate your time, and I love learning from people like you are crushing in this field. Because I find a lot of joy in this phase of rehab as well as performance. So I appreciate you hopping on, and have a great rest of your day.
Likewise, brother. Thanks for having me.